to dedicate this talk to Linda's father, who had the outside this week, Chaim Tzvi Hirsch and Avram Yitzchak. He was a great chess player and a shtickle philosopher. A typical description of the great intellectuals of Europe. They came from Riga and Vince, Rogachev and Simcha, quite a bit. His father apparently was a chazan and davened there with Rameh Simcha in the same shul, so it's part of the real in-group of halacha and Torah. Anyway, the ninth candle of Chanukah. And everybody knows that Chanukah has 8 days, so we celebrate with 8 lights and a Shamash. I'm not the first to write and talk about the ninth candle. Not meaning the Shamash, we'll see right away, but ninth candle. Now, Chaim Sabato, in one of his books, when I came into the Sephardi world by Chana marrying Roni, well, I had to learn how to eat Pesach matzah and a lot of other things, but so I don't know, what do I know about challah? Nothing. So, in one of his books, he talks about a nine-place candelabra. And I said, well, what's that all about? It's 8 days. So what's 9 days? Apparently, there was a time there when there was a plague in the city, and to commemorate coming through that plague, they added another candle to Chanukah. Now, don't jump right away about halakha, because this is a hidur mitzvah. Lighting the 8 candles, either one way, according to Beit Shammai, or the other way, 8 to 1. This is a refinement and embellishment of the mitzvah, but the mitzvah in the Gemara is 1 candle each day. So, because I asked right away, well, wait, there's a halacha. I mean, I'm sure they wouldn't. This is the town of Ibn Ezra. they wouldn't break a halacha. They do something else. But here there's no halacha involved. It's a hidur mitzvah, an embellishment of the mitzvah itself. So therefore, to add a candle because of this commemoration is certainly within the halachic bound. Okay. Chanukah. For contemporary Israelis, Chanukah is the story of a great military victory. Some put Hashem in the picture, some don't. But the basic orientation is to say something about Chanukah that's relevant. And indeed, Israel, the new state, 1948, had to fight for its existence, is still fighting for its existence. And so Chanukah, in the literature, when you read, like you have a number of manuals and you read some of the literature, you see that the motif of the Israeli public vis-a-vis Chanukah is to make it relevant and to talk about the great victory. The issue of the oil that burned for 8 days, that's sort of played down or not mentioned much in that literature. But the basic point was this attempt to make it relevant, to say something that's relevant, that has some meaning for the people. Okay, Chanukah is against Greeks, Greek civilization, Greek society, and especially Greek philosophy. Now, one could argue that and say, look, you're narrowing it down too much when you limit it to Greek philosophy. However, it certainly was one of the key dimensions in the Hellenism and the whole development of medieval philosophy. We went through a legacy of Greek philosophy. It was a 1,000-year legacy until the 17th century. It was a big thing. And we had both sides of the fence. What's the value for Torah of philosophy, and does it help? Does it do something? Does it add? Or is it a detriment? And that battle still rages today, but this was the basic point. Chanukah is against Greek philosophy. But against means, what's it for? What's the pro? This is the negative. So, in the book on Chanukah that I wrote, we talked about and focused attention on this business of Greek philosophy versus Torah science. In this little book, I talked about showing, and I try to indicate, just set up the basic orientation to indicate that it was against philosophy, against metaphysics, which we'll get to right away, but in the name of or for Torah. And what was the point? On the back it said here, for example, Chanukah is a celebration of the victory of the Jewish faith over Greek philosophy, yet it envisions a future when both philosophy and faith will wane, and when Chaim, the life and vitality of every individual, emerges as the great principle to guide human interactions as well as our scientific ambitions. And the book was subtitled A Light for the Future, and that was the motif. What I want to do tonight is very briefly go over the basic argument, which is worth to listen to, in this book, and then switch into the modern inheritors of metaphysics, which in the West starts with Descartes, continues and has its great limelights, among their others, in Immanuel Kant, and then in the modern world in Nietzsche and Heidegger, and
Bertrand Russell.
no, Bertrand Russell's not in metaphysics, that's for sure. But he wrote. But I mean, Russell touched everything. I always told students of mine, if you want to get an A in a philosophy term paper, you take a book by Russell. He wrote 130 books. Take a book by Russell on the topic, women, politics, Soviet Union, or whatever you want. 130 books, you know. He was a great writer, and he knew how to make fudge. If you read carefully, many times he writes, and all of a sudden he lost the argument. And instead was a nice chocolate pudding. But you didn't catch. Well, a great writer, but nevertheless a great writer. And so I told the people, you got an A for a paper. Get the topic from Russell, write the paper. You'll find the places where he fumbles a little bit. That's your critical section. Open up, write your 3 pages on critical section, you got an A. That's it. Simple thing like that. Read Bertrand Russell. Okay. B'derech Agav, everybody knows, I got a letter from Bertrand Russell. He was known not to answer anybody. I wrote my dissertation on Whitehead. Whitehead worked with Russell on Principia Mathematica, and I had a Wittgenstein critique of Whitehead, and there was nothing in the literature. When you work for a doctorate, you know, you don't want to do things yourself. You want to have sources. So you could say, okay, this guy said that, this guy said that. Well, there was nothing to say. I mean, there was nothing in the literature. How to do it myself. Well, it makes you a little scared. But anyway, I wrote Russell a letter on those postal things that you fold up with Mr. Russell and this and that. No Kunsten or anything like that. And he was known not to answer. He said, look, read my books. And so I wrote him a letter asking him if he ever introduced Wittgenstein to Whitehead, because Russell wrote the introduction to Wittgenstein Tractatus in 1921. And so I had this thing, and sure enough, the talk of Boston. Joe Levinson got a letter from Bertrand Russell. I should put it online. Maybe it's worth $10,000. Because he didn't like the typist. She made a few mistakes, so he wrote in his own hand. He changed what she wrote. Okay, one day maybe we'll hit it. Go for it. But anyway, Bertrand Russell. Okay, so what I want to do now, just very briefly, is give over this fundamental piece, which was led to the conclusion that Torah is for science against philosophy, which is not for science. It has its own dimension and so on. Okay, so in the Kabbalah system, there's a famous discussion, clarification on what's called the 10 sfirot. The Sefirot, in short, are a description of the world of the Neshama. That give you a full description of the world of the Neshama, and it was built on five units, but there was Keter, Chochma, Bina, each one had a value of 1.0, and then there was Chesed, Bura, Tiferes, Netzach, so each one had a value of 0.1, and then Malchut had a value of 0.01. And so this was the whole system with Esesirot. But the problem was, when you say Das, well, that's the 11th Sefira. It's Keter, Chochma, Bina, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchut. That's 10. Well, everybody knows that Das is one of the Sefirot. Chabad is Chochma, Bina, Da'at. I mean, so it's known that, so the question was, well, the system is built on 10, not on 9, or not on 11. So the basic point was, okay, what is this Da'at business? So, the basic orientation in the Kabbalah systematics was that there's Keter at the top, Chochma, Bina, then Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Hod, and Da'at is not in the picture. So, the basic orientation was that in the Kabbalah system, each of the Sefirot had many dimensions, and one of them was the outside dimension and the inside dimension. It's not important to know the details, but what the point was, there was an outside and an inside. And so, Da'at was the inside of Keter. So therefore, the 10th Sefira was not itself, by itself, like the other 10, but it was a subset or a dimension, shall we say, of Keter, the inside teaching of Keter, and then there's the outside teaching, and Da'at is the inside teaching. So what's the inside teaching? So Da'at meant intelligence, problem solving, relating to practical things of life. And, as the word indicates for us in modern Hebrew, Mada comes from the word Da'at, and after the scientific revolution, Da'at included what we call science. Of course, science is much more than organized common sense and organized intelligence. However, it's the same orientation. There was Keter, the crown, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Chochma, Bina, Da'at, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. So if Da'at is the inside of Keter, and Keter is at the top, so the question is obvious. Why, if it's Bimkom Keter, the Vilna Gaon's words are Da'at, Bimkom, 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 in the place of, instead of, his Lashon, instead of, Da'at, instead of Keter. Well, so again, so it should be on the map, the usual diagram of the Sefirot when it starts at the top and goes down and so forth. 1, 2, middle, 1, 2, middle, and so forth. So it doesn't work like that. It says Da'at is the inside of Keter. Good. So it should go in the Keter slot. But it doesn't go in the Keter slot. It goes after Chochma and Bina, which have to do with mental activities. It's not important for the moment. And between those mental activities, as a transition to the emotional world of Chesed, kindness, and so forth, the next 6 are emotional, feeling dimension, and the Malchut is the action dimension. So you have in the basic orientation, and you know I build on that, very important, that you have 3 fundamental packages of dimensions of the human being. The intellection, the feeling dimension, and the bodily dimension, the action dimension. And you heard many times from here that for me, each one of these exists in the field of the other 2. But there's a dominance. The dominance is there, like in a male and a female. there's a dominance, but each person, a male and a female, have male components and female components. But there's a dominance when you're a man, a dominance of one set and less of the other. And so the same thing happens. There is no intellection. There was no thinking without some sense of feeling, some sense of usability in action. And there's no feeling without action and without intellection. There's an interrelation of functions and structures between these three domains. Of course, where are we in Western science? We're trying to understand something about the life system. Well, look at all the complexity. Look at all the complexity just from a little thing coming out of the Kabbalah of having these fundamental dimensions of the human being. Unbelievable. And we still work and striving for eventual breakthrough on how these things combine, how they dominate, and how they localize in different dimensions. Remember, you're dealing now from the body up till, including the unconscious. When Freud came out with the unconscious, it added another dimension to the human being. So it's not only consciousness, it's also the unconscious. Okay, so what do we see? We see that in Dat, Bimkom, Keter, what we see is that instead of it being on the top, it's in the middle between the emotional dimension, the feeling dimension, and the intellectual dimension. Okay, this is the orientation in the Kabbalah. And as I said, when we look at it this way, we have Das Bimkom Keter, and Das means, in this orientation, includes the scientific understanding. Now, there are a number of principles in the Kabbalah that make this, drive it home. One is, Ein Tikkun Melamala Lamata. There is no perfectibility. There is no human being working on themselves for creativity, for development of different dimensions. There is none of that. Where am I? Without.
You're saying Lamala Lamata.
Yeah, none of Lamala Lamata. There is none of that from the top to the bottom. That's a fundamental principle in all of the Kabbalah system. Ein Tikkun Melamala Lamata, which means that the Tikkun, the perfectibility, starts from the actional dimension, moves into the feeling dimension, and up into the intellectual dimension. And indeed, on my understanding of the text, there's no Keter. There's Dat, Bimkom, Keter. So if you're starting at the bottom, and you go up, then you have Malchut at the bottom, then you have 6, so that's 7. And then you have Dat is 8, then you have Chokhmah and Bina. You never get to Keter. So this to me was indicative of a real deep understanding that in Torah we don't work with unknowables. The basic line is, it's supposed to be in the Zohar, but I never found it in the Zohar. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Torah, v'Yisrael, Chad Hu, are one, Mamash. You read Rav Tzadok, you see his quotation. It's not there in the Zohar. I couldn't find it. Maybe it's there. Somebody will pick it up. I couldn't find it. I asked a couple of people who were in the know. They couldn't find it. But it's come down as part of the tradition. How late? It's not in Chazal. But how late it is, I don't know. But the basic point was that you have this. Where am I?
Rav Tzadok and
unknowables.
Right. That we don't work with unknowables. Right. We don't work with unknowables, so we work with something that we can handle. And of course, Lo Bashamayim He, and so we work with things that we can handle. And so when Rab Nachman says Mamash, not metaphorically, in reality, which means, in a different way of speaking, that the operational definitions of HaKadosh Baruch Hu are Torah and Yisrael. In other words, we deal with things that we can handle and not with unknowable. And the Keter is unknowable. Okay, so this is this principle of Ein Tikkun Melamala Lamata. So with that, I tried to indicate in that little booklet here, to indicate the whole Torah orientation to life is really not philosophical and basically a scientific understanding. We will come to that at the end of this talk, and you'll see the power and where the whole thing was and is. Okay, so Da'at bimkom keter. Okay. Now, where's the relevance? Where's the relevance of Chanukah? If Chanukah is against the Greeks and against metaphysics, who cares? Oh yeah, I'm a philosophy person. Well, sure, a philosophy person is interested in metaphysics. I mean, that's part of philosophy. You can't be a decent philosopher unless you've tapped into metaphysics. So we start with Plato and Aristotle, and for most people that's enough. They go off into different dimensions. But for those people, like myself, it's very relevant. Well, but that's not the rest of the people. I mean, the rest of the people are interested in mitzvot, interested in Torah way of life, and not too much interested in metaphysics. What does it have to do with anything? And indeed, metaphysics did not end with the scientific revolution. It continued and started over continued in Descartes and this whole tradition, and is still with us today. And one of the high-level key people representing metaphysics in philosophy is Heidegger, a forerunner on Nietzsche. He came after Nietzsche. He wrote 3 volumes about Nietzsche, and he used Nietzsche as a kind of a takeoff. Nietzsche was on the way, let's put it that way. Nietzsche was on the way to a redefinition of metaphysics that fits into the contemporary world. And so Heidegger, I put them together because Heidegger built on Nietzsche, and he had critique on Nietzsche, and in effect said, look, you started, but you didn't finish the job. I'm going to finish the job. And Heidegger today is the number one 20th century representative of metaphysics. But it's a metaphysics that changed, that is a significant revolution. And so even though it kept the old title metaphysics or ontology, whatever the thing, nevertheless, it's still with us, and the question for tonight is to see and talk about that vis-a-vis Torah. Okay. Metaphysics. I'll take the liberty of reading one little paragraph just to not to get across any understanding or clarification, but just to give you a kind of a drift, a kind of a smell for what this is. It's not that, people run away. Metaphysics, is one of these words that sort of scare people away. When you talk about ethics in philosophy, you talk about aesthetics, you talk about history and so on. But when you talk about metaphysics, it starts to scare people away. Metaphysics relates to things, thoughts, and terms. Things, thoughts, and terms. There are uses of language. The modes of knowledge and the kinds of being. So language, being, and knowledge are topics in the metaphysics. Metaphysics relates to the realization that in relating to any of the above, there is mention of one, a few, or all of the others. In other words, metaphysics is such that the questions it asks and the arguments it puts forth and the clarifications it puts forth have this kind of a picture where if you start talking about knowledge, you won't end with knowledge. You'll end with something else that's related. You start talking about logic, you won't end with logic. In other words, we're not talking like in physics or the positive sciences where if you begin with physics, You could have speculations and so on, but you end with physics. You begin with economics, you end with economics. Metaphysics, because of the complexity, has these movability. It has this kind of a thing where, again, metaphysics relates to the realization that in relating to any one of the above, to thoughts, terms, things, there is mention of one, few, or all the others. The history of metaphysics relates to the changes over time of the primacy of being, knowledge, or language. The history of metaphysics is Greek, pre-Greek, and post-Greek. That needs a comment. When we went to school, not to worry the old man, civilization began with Homer. And before Homer, before the Greeks, everything was a kind of a barbarian world. Well, there was some guy who came out in those days, I forget his name, on Babylonian astronomy, and that opened up the whole thing. Said, what? There were people before? There were people before the that knew something about astronomy? There were people before, and then the pyramids came in and all kinds of things came in. And indeed, in the last couple of 100 years of research and so forth, there's been a tremendous opening up of the pre-Greek world and of the Orient included. Okay, but here, for tonight, and you'll see a little later, metaphysics, the history of metaphysics is Greek, post-Greek, okay. We have Heidegger, we have the tradition from Descartes and so on, that's post-Greek, but also pre-Greek. And that's to be emphasized. And indeed, the Chumash world, right,
Pre-Greek.
is pre-Greek.
What about
The Babylonian world, the
Hammurabi.
Egyptian world, and so on. So there was a cross-culture and everything. It's not important for tonight, but the basic point is, on the view that I'm taking, and you'll see why at the end, there is such a thing as pre-Greek metaphysics. And Yisrael, Moshe Rabbeinu, and so on, what eventually becomes Torah, is in that category of pre-Greek metaphysics. So that's a chiddush, and I'll show it to you a little later. The primacy of post-Greek metaphysics is knowledge. The primacy of pre-Greek metaphysics is language. And the primacy of Greek metaphysics was being. In other words, given these three basic components, there were dominances, fundamental dominances in the three categories that I'm talking about. That there, in the Greek world, all the questions in the last analysis related to being. Even question like Plato raises, is non-being a form of being? Well, it is. It's something. Anything that is somehow has to relate to being. So there's beings, and then there's being. Then there's existences, then there's being. Then there's reality, and there's actuality. And so any term that you use about things that are, the Charian is, eventually get put into a picture, the basic principle of which was being. From Descartes on, the basic principle of metaphysics was knowledge. Descartes' famous beginning point was, I think, therefore I am. So the I think, we're in the domain of thought. So that the whole medieval metaphysics was in effect shifted and redone, reformulated between the Descartes in the 17th century all through the 18th century. Took its primary, its highest level formulation was in Immanuel Kant, and indeed Heidegger wrote a number of books about Kant to show how Kant didn't go all the way. Nietzsche was on the way, but didn't go all the way. Kant was caught or stuck, not in being, but in knowledge. Knowledge was the basic orientation. And indeed, critique of pure reason. We're talking knowledge. We're talking think terms. Okay? So Kant was this culmination of the Cartesian beginning point, and it was a metaphysics built on the primacy of knowledge and its dimensions. And the Descartes Kant picture is Nietzsche and Heidegger. And that's what we'll get to right away. And so I said, okay, in this little piece that I wrote up just to introduce the topic, the focus of attention was not on knowledge, but on language. We see that right away in a very simple thing. If you read Heidegger, you see. He takes a sentence. He's talking about thinking. What is thinking? He wrote a book, What is a Thing? So he talked about thinking. And he looks at the sentence that he wrote or somebody else wrote, and they say, thinking is putting together this and this. So he says, don't answer the question. What do you mean putting together? What does that mean? Wait a minute, that was just the language to... I didn't mean anything by that serious. That's not a philosophical term. Oh no, that's very important. The way one speaks about terms, language, knowledge, and so forth, in ordinary language and sentences, okay, in ordinary language. So the methodology of Heidegger, he's doing metaphysics. So why didn't he answer the question? Does this thing I'm talking about have these properties or not have these properties? If it was a scientific question, that's what you jump right in and answer the question. You're not worried about how the guy asked the question. But in Heidegger, part of the methodology is to say, wait a minute, don't jump so fast and answer the question. What does it mean, this word and this phrase and that phrase? And upon analysis of those things, he comes to the answer to the question without even saying, I'm going to give you an answer to the question. In other words, it's not accidental. It's not the mikra that when people talk about words, talk about language, talk about existence, talk about reality, the language they use is not irrelevant to it, since the third dimension of post-Descartes, post-Kant metaphysics in Heidegger is about language primacy. And so I'm showing you in the methodology. Take my word for it. If you read Heidegger, you'll see he stops, instead of answering the questions, he stops and he says, now what does that mean? What does that mean? In the short form, metaphysics is about that and what? That and what? What is what? What is that? Which one is the basis of the other one? That is indeterminate. Doesn't have shape, it's not, to say what, well, a chair, well, that's determinate. Now the question is, what's the relationship? Now that sounds, well, what do you mean? Take your choice and that's all. You need both. You need things that are indeterminate, that, and you need things that are what? Because you need both. How do they fit together? Well, that's one of the big topics in Heidegger. How does it fit together? And the clue, methodologically, is what I said before about his going to ordinary language and analyzing, discussing the way the topic was talked about, either in the past or by himself. And the reader trying to study Heidegger is unless you're tuned into that method, you miss and won't understand what he's talking about. You say, look, he's off the topic. He didn't answer the question. Well, he's answering the question. But he's answering the question like that, by dealing with ordinary language presentation and that what that means. Okay, so in working I came to Heidegger this last month or two by a crazy indirect route, and all of a sudden things emerged, just it blew the mind. So much so that I had to stop writing on one piece, one book, and continued on the other. I read 6 books of Heidegger in the last month or so, 2 months, and I reread, and I see my old comments in the margin, this was read in 3 days, being in time, 1994. In the back I always put, and some of my comments. And okay, so there it was. I saw what I did it then, and there it was now in emphasis and in spades. The comments that I put in the margin were so powerful, it forced me to stop what was going on. And I want to show you that tonight. But the basic point here is that as I worked through this started, just a very quick thing of the story, this started with the book on the proclamation. And the proclamation of the Israeli state says the state will be based on natural right and historic right. And I showed in the book that natural right is an old-fashioned concept that was critiqued by Rousseau, and after Rousseau there is no real viable concept of natural right. In the UN Charter we talk about human rights, but not natural right. There was the medieval tradition was based on natural law. There was law by nature and law by convention, and this distinction of nature and convention was dominant and organized the whole practical world. And so you had this by convention, by nature. Okay, now keep on forgetting what I want to say.
Proclamation.
Yeah, so in the proclamation they said about natural right. They said, look, that's not, and I had a comparison with the American Declaration, which deals with natural right, natural law. And I showed there was something there, and this and that. They're non-viable. Historic right. Historic right means biblical right. It means God promised it to the people, to Kam Yisrael. Well, wait a minute. In the old terms, that's by convention. Well, in Islam, God took it away from the Jewish people, even though He promised it, because they didn't keep the mitzvah. It's a theological argument, but there was change. Depends who's talking, who's doing the talking. You're not dealing now with nature or reason, which has a universalist kind of a dimension. You're dealing with something that's convention, that's relevance. Yeah, for us, God promised it, but not to somebody else. So you had this. You're gonna have to remind me all the time where I am.
Proclamation.
Okay, so I'm in the. So I'm saying so. Okay, so I had this notion of historic right. Okay, and I analyzed it, and I showed that it's really not the case. Okay, in so doing, I went back to something that's very big in my orientation, which is Moshe Rabbeinu, what I call life energy, a term that just catches something about the life system, but with no detail, not enough detail to say anything significant. I tell the reader there's no definition, but the word and the phrase is used in the Book of the Dead, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, in the healing tradition. Barbara Brennan uses the same word, life energy. In other words, it's a word or a phrase that's capturing all of this fullness of the human being, but it's not in the form of a definition that one can now say, okay, let's go and we can keep it straight. It changes its meaning depending on the context that you're working with. Okay, so for me, Moshe Rabbeinu had a conception of life, an orientation to life that was built on what I call life energy. When one examines and writes up what that orientation was, you see that it did not have the usual conception of time that we have in the West. It didn't have the usual conception of logic that we have in the West. And so it had a primacy on performative language. And now you see the link.
Right.
It had a primacy on language. Now you could say, look, I'm not interested in the history. writing came about 6,000, 7,000 BC. We're talking now about oral language. How writing developed and how it fed back into oral language and everything is a big topic. I'm not going to go into anything like that. But the basic point was that the orientation in this characterization of Moshe Rabbeinu, life energy, there was no such thing as time. There was no such thing as history. There was no such thing as looking at events in terms of where they are now, where they're going, and how they develop. There was, instead of time, there were associations that took place in time. But when the culture and Moshe Rabbeinu looked at them, he looked at them all in one shot. In other words, the past, not in linear, where the past is here and then it's gone, and we have the point where the present is, and then from the present on we have the future. No, they were transformed into a package of associations. The association, that package had no time. In other language, there's like linear time, past, present, and future. And this orientation was as if to say there was a discontinuity between past, present, and future. There was past, quantum jump, and then future. So without the continuity, we're in some kind of a world other than the way we usually understand time. Time is built on a continuous. We depict it by a line, right? And the line is continuous. It doesn't break. We can break it. And when we break it, we get durations of time. So the now, which can be just one point on the line, it could be expanded to have from this to this, and we date the system, and we put the dates on, and we have what we call duration. Okay, so there is something what I call the now. I even say, I shouldn't say the now. Now. Because there are as many nows as there are individuals who construct the who package their thinking that way. So it misleads a little bit to say the now, because it sounds like the present, and I'm not talking about the present. So we're talking about, and then we talked about, there's a whole discussion of the nature of languages in the Middle East and so on, and other countries, which have in the tenses, in the grammatical structure of the language, you see it's not linear. They don't have the future tense or the past tense. And there are languages like, for us it's very hard to understand what that is. You look at Levi-Strauss and the anthropology world, well, one of the problems that they have always was to try to capture what the language of the culture is. And indeed, some of the older cultures were built on the primacy of language, more particularly on the primacy of performative utterances, performative language. There are three basic notions of language. There's assertion. You assert something. That was the basis of Greek metaphysics, the assertion. Heidegger makes big point out of that. True, it was the whole model was the assertion, the proposition, putting words together, having a subject and a predicate. The whole. That's why, for example, when you read the translation, the Greek, Chanukah, you read the Greek translation of the Bible, the Chumash, in the Septuagint. Well, Chazal said, look, it was necessary because the culture was that way. But we have to fast. Well, of course we have to fast, because what did the Greeks do? If there's a metaphysics built on the primacy of performative language in Yisrael, the Greeks translated everything into assertive language. And to it, a simple thing like, the noun is first. The book begins theos, God. Well, the Chumash doesn't begin, says God. There's Breshit bara Elokim. Et Hashemayim v'et haaretz. Well, take your off the shelf here, the Septuagint. Well, it restructured everything in terms of assertion, and the fundamental character of assertion is subject and predicate. And then Aristotle formulated the rules He was the first to formulate the rules of this. There was operating before Aristotle. People use it, but he was the first to formulate the whole picture. And so, in the Aristotelian picture, it's fundamentally built on the assertive use of language and not the performative use of language, and indeed not the command use of language. There's three fundamental uses, functions of language. One is assertion. Assertion, as you can see, true or false, meaningful, not meaningful, and so forth. Then there's command, and we write it usually with an exclamation point. And then there's performative. Hareat mekudeshet. Hare ze hegdish. And indeed, the first story in the Chumash, the creation story, what does it say? What's the form? It says, Yehi or. Yehi is performative language.
Right.
When you have hegdish and you say, let there be, hegdish, let there be. Well, that's a performative utterance. So here you see right away in the Chumash, when we're talking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu creating the world, the basic structure that's giving meaning to what that is, and sometime we'll go again into the creation story from this point of view, which we didn't do last time or once before. And you'll see the Chumash opens up and it exemplifies the point I made that there is a pre-Greek metaphysics. But it's built on the primacy of language, and more particularly the primacy of performative language. And so, Yehi, and indeed in the Gan Eden story, Adam Rishon is looking for a mate, and it says, whatever you take the person to be is what the person is. So call it operational definition, whatever you want, but the basic point is we're dealing with performative language. So much so that in the idolatry countries, in the cults, in the idolatry world, the idol can be sitting right in front of you. Okay? But by bestowing upon it a status, by bestowing upon it a performative, the culture was such that it believed that the idol was down the block. It's right in front of your eyes. What do you mean? We say that's crazy. It's right in front of your eyes. How can you go believe in an idol that can be in two places at the same time? Now, if we want to talk about schizophrenia, we want to talk about mental illness, indeed, in mental illness, we do have experiences like that which indicate this thing, that a thing can be in two places at the same time. I mean, so in mental illness, but in the basic orientation for the culture, this was the power of the idol. Now we say it's crazy. Who would ever be so stupid to do something? But when the whole culture is built on this, on performative language, this opens up a whole dimension. Indeed. I said, in passing, Samuel Beckett, the great playwright of the 20th century, probably one of the greatest English writers. Incidentally, he walked around with a mug and David. He was from Ireland, but he was in Paris most of the time. He walked around with a mug and David. During the war, he was philo-Jewish. I mean, real Jewish orientation and everything. But basically, if you read his books and you read his plays, Waiting for Godot is the famous one, and you see, what did he do? I call him the Einstein of Kohelet. Kohelet means Hakol Havel. So what did Beckett do? He took the play, the novel, his media, and he changed things that you would say are essential to the writing. No punctuation, no capitals, no periods, no comma. When Waiting for Godot, we say goodbye, Pogo, last scene, goodbye. Well, he didn't walk off stage. But, I mean, the diction has to match the action. I mean, if a guy says goodbye, either the curtain comes down or he walks off stage. I mean, opera. You have the aria. When it's finished, the guy doesn't just stand there. He moves. The action has to fit. Beckett took every single component of the novel and the play, the drama, changed things that everybody would say, well, you changed, this is not a play. He has a play called Breath, Hevel. He has a play called Breath, 57 seconds. The curtain goes up, there's a garbage can here, a garbage can here, and 2 light beams, and the curtain comes down. 57 seconds! That's a play. That's a play. In other words, Beckett took everything in the repertoire of the novel and the drama and showed that the world, these world, mini worlds, shall we say, are not hakol havel. There's always something to be done. The famous line in Waiting for Godot, if you read the play, is about 2 beggars and so on. The famous repeat line in the text is, there's always something to be done. And so if you translate it to religion terms, there's always something to be done. No matter how rough the situation is, no matter how difficult it is to go through, how much pain it gives and hurt, there's always your relation, how you package it. And how you package it is something that can be done by you. You are always at the center. No matter how life, whatever it brings, you're always at the center. So here was Beckett, I call it, I wrote the piece about Beckett in a book on Rav Soloveitchik. And I said, Rav Soloveitchik, a lonely man of faith, and this and that. And I said, well, Chochma Bagoyim Tamid. If you find insight by non-Jews, try to grapple with it and understand it. Well, here, Beckett, there's no Hester Panim. There's no God hiding his face. But the Rav, in some of the writings, had this dimension. When you read the book on Tshuva and other writings, you see that it's not as bland as I'm making it now, because the Rav was much more sensitive to the whole picture that I'm critiquing. But that's not for tonight. But the basic point was that Beckett had this orientation. Now, just imagine, instead of imagining like the novel, have the novel, and you read it, no punctuation, you don't know where the sentence ends, you don't know what to do. But indeed, something comes across, and you do get a message that comes in. Now imagine a culture, if you could. Now imagine a culture where they didn't make assertions. They just start off with commands. They didn't talk to make assertions. They were always in an advice context. Do this, do that, do this, do that, and no explanations, no tshuva, just the command. If you envision something like that, we're in a different world. And of course, the vestiges of that are right in the text. There's 400 places in Tanakh where it says the word tzivuy or tzava, or the word of command. That's not b'mikra. That's part of the language, the dominance of the language. Assertion was at the bottom, the middle was command, and the fundamental was performative. And so you imagine Beckett, imagine writing a novel or writing things where you only do performatives. Okay? That's the culture. So what I found was that in understanding their conception of time, their conception of language, how they thought, and indicative of a way that is not West, it's not Western. So then I immediately changed the topic of the book, stopped writing on the proclamation, and wrote a book. I changed the title, The Dissolution of Historic Right. And what emerged in the discussion and in my writing, it emerged. I didn't plan it. I wasn't planning to write about history per se. All of a sudden, bingo, it popped me on the head. And here was this whole understanding of, I'm talking about life energy, Moshe Rabbeinu, It doesn't have our conceptions. So I said, if you build on Moshe Rabbeinu, the notion of historic right disappears. There's no historic right. So the whole idea of right and the whole idea of historic, temporal, has to be restructured. So there is a substitute, that these exist, these time things, the dated things exist not as temporal, but in a kind of a space where they're all together. And there was a culture built on that. For us, that's an exception to the rule, because we think dominance of assertion. And now in the 20th century metaphysics, there is this shift to the dominance of language in Heidegger. And to top the story, where did I get this? It wasn't me. There was a guy, Pedersen, Johannes Pedersen, a Scandinavian, wrote a book called Israel, Its Life and Culture, 2 volumes, 1926. It was the book on ancient Israel used in all the Protestant seminaries in the United States. I was then at Union Theological Seminary when I was at Columbia. Across the street was Union, the Protestant world. I wanted to see how they taught the Chumash. So I sat there with a kippah in Protestant Theological, Union Theological Seminary, and there were 200 people, and I listened to the lectures and I tried to understand how and where they differed in their understanding of what they call the Old Testament. I had a guy named Meilenberg, I still remember the name. A German guy, beautiful, neshama, adin person, fantastic, and gave a fantastic course. There were 250 people in the audience there. Okay, so what did I find? So all of a sudden, I got this. So I say I got this from Pedersen. Pedersen was a philologist in Hebrew and Semitic languages in Denmark, and he entered the text like an anthropologist. And he wrote his book. In his book, he tells you what is the neshama, what is bracha, what is kavod, what are these things that are carrying, what are these things that are carrying the Chumash world. He was concerned with Tanakh across the board. I'm concerned primarily with Chumash, but it makes no difference. He also recognized something that I wrote about and talked about, that there was a big significant shift in things, including language, when the prophets, in the king's period of Shlomo Melech, David Melech, and the prophets, there was a shift and a restructuration of knowledge and understanding, and with it went a loss of this whole Moshe orientation to life. And indeed, in my work, I'm trying, with others, trying to recover that picture, that thing, that whole dimension that was lost. So look at it. What emerged? There's no history. So I said, well, got to read Heidegger again. So I went to the shelf, took off the book, and it said there, read 3.5 days, 1994. Okay. So I started to read Heidegger. So I did about half of that, and then I have mostly in Xerox, so the whole table is full of Xerox papers, and I read 4 or 5 Heidegger books. What is thinking, what is the thing, and so on, and so on. And lo and behold, being and time. Time and being. Here's another essay called Time and Being. So, what was his chiddush? On regular Echad, his chiddush was that in order to enter the post-Cartesian, Kantian world of metaphysics, one has to relate to language not only in the methodology, but in the characteristics of the language, in the performative. For example, I taught Descartes for many years. I taught Descartes. I taught 17th century philosophy. I taught Descartes. I never took and spent time on saying Descartes posited an axiom set for Euclidean geometry. To posit is a performative. To posit is to say, I posit. That's what a performer is. It looks like an assertion, but that's another characteristic. It easily can be transformed into assertions, but conceptually there is a difference. Okay, I'm not going to go into that tonight. But the point is that it easily can be mistaken for an assertion. When the person says, I am, like I'm very big on the self-identity performance. I am Joe. I am a philosophy person. I am Jewish, and so on. This I am, what do you mean? Let there be, or let me be. In other words, it looks like a true or false thing. When you say, I'm Jewish, so you go and say, what's your proof? You're already in the assertion, Greek world, and so on. You're not primacy of language. If you interpret it to mean, let me be what I am, however you want to phrase it, it's a performative. To declare, for example, is to say, I declare. To promise is to say, I promise. Then there's usually coupled with it other actions and things that go with it. To christen a ship is to say, Queen Mary, with the bottle of champagne. To give the ring and say, Harei Ad Mekudesheli. These are performative uses of language. In the West, of course, in any legal system that's advanced, you have the whole system is built on statuses, legal statuses, performatives. And here we're talking about a much wider framework where we're talking about everything it's going to turn out to be in metaphysics. Instead of having being at the top or knowledge at the top, meaning at the top that it enters into all the different pieces, like a puzzle. Instead of having that, we're going to have language, more specifically performative language. So when I taught Descartes, for example, I didn't spend time on the word posit. Oh, read Heidegger. Read Heidegger. And he's writing 10 pages, and going nice, you read it, and understand what he's talking about, and so on. Misunderstand, look again, read it, and all of a sudden he says the word posit. Oh, wait a minute! Well, being tuned into performative, I stopped. When I taught Descartes, I never stopped. I just taught Descartes. The question was, what's his understanding of being? What's his understanding of this? You ask a question, jump in, give him the answer. That's how I organized the course. Well, I didn't have a methodology of looking at the words. Well, of course, reading the book and a number of pieces by Heidegger. Well, of course, when you're home and shall I say, leave from work, it's a machai. You can read a book in 3 days. What's the problem? So it's a great thing. If you know what to do with your time when you're retired, it's a great thing, for sure. Okay, so when I look at the book, I encircled in red, posit. Then it dawned on me, a lot of things. What do we do with mathematics? Descartes was a mathematician, founder of analytic geometry. And he introduced to the world the mathematical way of thinking. And then that was the key for his metaphysics. I think, therefore I am, and so on and so on. And Heidegger discusses Descartes. And he points to all these things out. He doesn't use the word performative. I didn't think he used the word performative. But he doesn't use it. But for me, it's a red flag. The guy says posit. Well, what do we do with an axiom system? We say, let there be the shortest line between 2 points. Let there be. And we give the 5 Euclidean axioms. Now, where would I come to waste my time on the word posit? Well, you know what it turns out to be? That as he goes through the analyses of the different components of knowledge, for example, in Kant, different components, all of a sudden you see the word posit. In the middle of a clarification of logic, for example, in the middle of a clarification of the law of contradiction, that you can't have a thing and it's contradictory at the same time in the same place, right? They're separate. The law of non-contradiction. Fine. So you're dealing with logic, okay? And he comes to the conclusion that logic, when it's reformulated, the law of non-contradiction, you can't be yes or no at the same time, the same place. They have in the traditional formulations the phrase at one and the same time. Phrase. In Aristotle, it was formulated in the beginning, and in Kant and others before the transition to the next level stage. There is a phrase in the formulation of the law of non-contradiction that is, what do I want to say? That is...
one at the same time?
One and the same time. So, in writing about Kant, Heidegger says, Kant reformulated the law of non-contradiction, and what was the reformulation? It had something to do with a subject cannot contradict a predicate. Hey, what happened to the time language? What happened to the time? In the formulation for 1,000 years, the formulation of the law of non-contradiction, I don't want to read it for you, but it's I wrote it up. The formulation of the law of contradiction, a fundamental principle of logic, which is the basis of thinking, the basis of reason, of understanding, it enters into the picture in some way, a psychological way, a metaphysical way, whatever. The point is that's fundamental. And it was formulated in terms of this phrase that included a temporal phrase. Wow! Kant comes along on Heidegger's interpretation, and he says, Kant says, I eliminated, in effect he says, I eliminated the time talk. This is my language. That's what he did. And he gives you what his formulation is. And he eliminated the time talk. Okay. Well, in a way, it's a kind of a move back to Moshe Rabbeinu. It's a kind of a move, going away. When you get to Heidegger himself, it turns out, it made me crazy. It turns out that I'm reading Heidegger and I'm reading me. I'm reading Heidegger and I'm reading Patterson. It's the same thing. We're talking, there's so much similarity between what he says, even the words he uses. He even uses the word now, in the context I'm talking about. So, I'm reading Heidegger, and I'm hearing myself reading Patterson. A crazy experience. And I'm asking myself, how could it be, what's the odds that a metaphysician like Heidegger, dealing with straight metaphysics and the history of metaphysics, that's his work, that's his material. How could it be that he gets a conclusion that is almost the same as the conclusion that I got from a philology, anthropology person? Two different fields completely. One is a science or a life science, whatever you want to call it, low level, high level. The point is, it was Patterson. I didn't make it up. I got it from this guy who talked about how they thought. They didn't think in logic terms. They didn't do this, they didn't do that, they did this instead. So I went crazy. I asked myself, what does that mean? What do we do? I still don't have a good answer. But one thing it implies is that if we go back into the biblical world of Moshe Rabbeinu, and we start to look for, develop, relate to these package of concepts that are in Heidegger, a metaphysician, all of a sudden we may find some big surprises about a different orientation to life, Lagamri. Just like in the Eastern world, Western civilization is very far removed from Eastern civilization. Eastern civilization is chock full of non-assertive language, of performatives. And so you have a whole, we talk about the clash of civilizations and how it's going to be overcome. Mm-hmm. Well, it could be that we're still in the old Western civilization. Huntington's book, I reread pieces of it in the last 4 weeks in relation to this business. He's still in the Western mode. The problem is, how do we make Eastern become Western? But let's what about the other way? What about how do we get Western civilization? Your stuff. How do we get Western civilization to incorporate and to develop aspects of Eastern civilization that are so different and make you perk up to say, well, like I said about the idols, it's crazy. You don't understand how it's so illogical and so stupid. The guy idol is right there. How can the person say they're thinking in the same place?
It sounds like magic, magical thinking. It's association.
But it's not magic.
The idol with...
Good. You ask a good question. It's not magic, but it has aspects that have come down as a magical dimension. When you translate all of this into, call it narrow existence terms, yes, you get something that looks like magic.
Well,
but conceptually speaking, there's no magic in the world. Period. So one has to explain, what does that look like? Did we get into Julian Jaynes and get into hypnosis and schizophrenia and other things that look like magic? For the schizophrenic, his world looks like a magic world. For the schizophrenic person, mentally ill person, yes, somebody can be in at the same, two different places at the same time. I mean, clear as the day. All the literature points out. I'm rereading Jane's book, and I was up to the chapter on hysteria and schizophrenia, and he makes a number of points. Again, so interesting. It's not to say that Moshe Rabbeinu was a sick world, was a mentally ill world, but so many of the things Jane says about mental illness, again, I like Pedersen reading the biblical world. So here's another guy. Here's a guy coming in from psychology. Crazy. Here's a guy coming in from psychology. So we got an anthropologist, linguist, we got a metaphysician, and we got a psychologist dealing with the nature of thought, and indeed in terms of mental illness and so on. 3 different orientation fields of thinking come out to more or less the same. And there's a 4th. There's another one. There's a guy, Yerushalmi. He was an Israeli, an old man. He was at Columbia. He passed away recently, I think. He was at Columbia. He took over Salo Baron's place in the history chair. I studied with Salo Baron. I took 2 years of Jewish history. The guy walked in the classroom, short, this big, this tall, and he shoot from the hip, 2 hours, not one note, not one thing. He'd go on the blackboard, that's all. And he would just come in and boy, a walking encyclopedia. Of course, his book, I think, was 18 volumes, socioeconomic history of the Jews, and so on, so on, so on. So he took over the Baron chair, that was his professor, and Yerushalmi made a big hit, world-renowned guy, in a book by what he called Zachor, Remembrance. And his basic point in that book, without the details, sometime we'll spend a whole session on Yerushalmi and the work, but the basic point was that our conception of historiography is built on old-fashioned assertion, notion of language, not rich enough, such that it's built on a linear conception of time. Chronicle, development, Thucydides, and so on. It's built on a linear conception of time, and he discovered what he called historical memory. Historical memory is a certain kind of a version of what I call the now. In other words, there's a memory space in which there are, quote, dated events. But in this frame, they're an association package.
Mythology.
They all exist at the same time. When you look at it this way, and you have an memory as an association package, well, there's no linear time. They all collapse into a conception that he says must be returned to historiography, to enrich and come back to, quote, an older pre-Greek metaphysic, we will yield a real richness of history that we didn't have before. And in his book on Freud, he wrote a book on Freud, he tries to develop this thing. And so, number 4 people, now we got a historian. And I mentioned Freud in passing. You read Freud, and you'll see that when Freud deals with mental illness and somewhat from the, not even in schizophrenia, other dimensions of unconscious life, the dream life, and so on and so on, again, you'll think you're reading Pedersen. And so what we have here are five entries from 5 different fields of thinking that have zoned in on something that's very, very similar. I'm not arguing now it's identically the same. I'm saying they're similar enough that the reader, just like me, the reader, when he would read these things and juxtapose them, like I did for the last month here, and juxtapose them, you would get the same impression that I got. You would think, go read Pedersen, and that's what he said. Why he's not the king of entry into the biblical world, I don't know. Because I read a lot of biblical criticism, a lot of biblical scholarship. I don't know, nobody, he's my Bible. Nobody comes close to Pedersen. No, but I haven't found somebody talking about the nature of thinking, how they thought, that they didn't have logic, about the notion of time. They had a different conception of time. Where is it? When I was there, this is 50 years ago, oh yeah, in the Protestant world, that was the book on Old Testament, was the Pedersen book. Matter of fact, when I found it from a burnt book sale, my book here, you'll see it's charred, I jumped for joy because there was no way to get it except out of the library. And the library copy was terrible, and I like to mark up things in the margin. And so when I found it in a book sale, I jumped for joy, and I spent $25 in a used thing, 2-volume Pedersen, Israel's Life and Culture. Okay, so here's something that emerged, and indeed it came out of the blue. I wasn't looking for anything like that. It came out of the blue, and it set me on a track, on a target of first continuing with Heidegger, finishing up some of his other books, and developing the orientation, and enriching my conception of Moshe Rabbeinu in terms of life energy. And so the point about tonight was to show, at least to intimate, without the detail. I was going to read sections, but I don't know if it's necessary to read. The idea being that whenever there's a discussion in the metaphysics, not only does Heidegger have this methodology, but what he's coming out with is, in my language, going back to the world of Moshe Rabbeinu, the world of Torah, which itself has been eclipsed and lost in the developments and the reconstructions of knowledge which took place in the prophet period, and then later in Chazal, and then later in the Rishonim. I mean, in other words, there were reconstructions, reconceptualizations. In those reconceptualizations, sometimes they bring out vestiges of the past, and sometimes they cover up vestiges of the past. In this case, for Yahadut, they cover up vestiges of the past, of this type that I'm talking about, and they push the Torah person like myself to say, let's rediscover, don't give up, because most of the people think you're crazy. Most of the people say there are no vestiges. We're satisfied with what Torah looks like. We're not satisfied with what Torah looks like. It's not relevant. It's lost a lot of dimension that would come in if we could recapture something that was lost. And so I say, if we ask the right questions about Chazal, if we come in looking for something, we're going to find it. And it's going to cause a revolution in the way we look at the Torah sources. We won't be complacent. We can't say, well, we got it pat. We got the Gemara down pat. We've got the whole halachic system down. We don't have it down because we've been firing on 2 cylinders. We've been firing, like in Heidegger says, Aristotle, you were great, but you didn't have the whole picture. You skewed everything to build it on assertion, assertive language. He uses the word, assertive language. He talks about it. And being. But we passed that. There was a scientific revolution. And there was Descartes and Kant. And now there was Heidegger. And so you're going to stuck Aristotle? Great. When I took my Aristotle course, they don't point that out. You're there to try to understand Aristotle. Go get the book off the shelf. You'll see. I was nicknamed Aristotle in Williamsburg on the Shabbat. Everybody, hey, Aristotle. Well, I was doing the Rambam, so I had to do Aristotle. So, but to be called Aristotle, that was my name. I knew, that everybody was on one side of the street, and then one guy would yell at Aristotle, and everybody would look up, who the hell is this crazy guy? But this was the case. As a matter of fact, I used to have a shiur with a guy, Harold Stern, all of a sudden passed away. He come from the University of Chicago, and in addition to taking a shiur on Chumash, every week we had a shiur. He lived near YU, uptown, 187th Street, and we used to learn Aristotle. Well, bis Michigan, but life brings you to do things that, look, if that's what you want to do, you got to do it. Okay, so anyway, what's the whole thing? The basic point is here that when you look at what's happened, and we can give some other time some more detail about the law of contradiction, how we handle logic, how each case you see the methodology working, and you see performative. Like I said, who would ever look at a logical system of an axiom set in geometry as positing? So what did I notice, to end the story, what did I notice? As he goes through Heidegger, as he goes through his critique of Nietzsche, to show that Nietzsche was on the way but did not quite complete the orientation, and then when he talks in his own right, and he talks about his own framework, what I'm talking about? Maybe that's Parkinson. It could be, I don't know. I doubt. But anyway,
Heidegger eventually getting back to Chanukah.
Anyway, no, I said I didn't deal with the details, but the point was that as you read Heidegger on different topics, what is a thing? Everybody knows what a thing is. But I said before, is it a that or a what? Well, so when Heidegger would deal with the question, over time, as you see his arguments, the development, all of a sudden, like in ordinary conversation, he puts in a performative. And that performative has results for the metaphysics. So, the guy would say, you're crazy. What do you mean? In conversation, we do that all the time. We're talking. One person is talking to another, and explaining something, and then all of a sudden the conversation shifts to advice. All of a sudden the conversation, but I'm Jewish. Well, that's a performative. And so in ordinary conversation, ordinary language, there's this constant shifting between, take a slice, half hour, you'll get all three uses of language. Command, advice, and performative, and assertion. You'll see it operated in the paradigm of Torah, which is conversation. And so what did I find in working a week, 2 weeks now on Heidegger, in finishing up the details, like on the law of contradiction? He posits something. He uses a word. I didn't use the word. In the text, it says, he posited such and such. Well, to posit is to make a performative. And then the content of that performative had implications for what he was talking about. Indeed, in this discussion that I talked about before, about the law of non-contradiction having a time dimension, the time dimension drops out because, or by reason of, a performative being entered into the midst of the analysis. Crazy. Unbelievable. Stick to the mode. You want to talk about assertions? Stick to assertions, stick to the arguments, the meanings, and so forth. What are you coming in all of a sudden? You want to make an axiom set? To make an axiom set, oh yeah, that's, I posit. Okay, I posit. Nature of a point, and so on and so on. Positing is a performative. But here what I found was, it enters into the analysis. So in the analysis of analyzing, he puts a performative in, and that performative, when he follows it through, all of a sudden leads to the dissolution of time in the formulation of the law of non-contradiction. Well, whoever did such a thing? Aristotle didn't do anything like that. Plato didn't do anything like that. Plato didn't use performative language in the midst of the dialogue, in the midst of the whole analysis. His paradigm was assertive language, and that's what he did. He used assertive language. Sure, you can have metaphor. Too bad Baruch's not here, but metaphor in this dimension is a type of assertive language. But it widens up the meanings when you have metaphorical meanings, not literal meanings, but metaphorical meanings. But that's still, the argument I have with Baruch, that's still, to me, in the domain of assertion. Primarily assertion. I never thought, or I haven't enough, about whether or not we can have metaphor. We do have metaphor in performative language, but the question is it intrinsic? How are we supposed to understand it, and so forth? But the basic thing I found was that in Heidegger, you not only have the methodology that I talked about, but you also have the entry in the analysis of a performative. Now, what is the thing? What's the greatness of that? You would say, oh, that's fudge. You got a problem, can't solve it. Smear it up with a little performative and you solve the problem. Right? Doesn't it sound like it? Oh no, it's not doing that. It's saying that the whole idea of positing can play a role in the analysis. Why? Because to posit doesn't have a basis other than the thing you say. There's no underpinning. To posit is to say, I posit. And then you give the content. But there's no explanation that's required. So, it turns out that it becomes, the use of that in the middle of a discourse becomes functionally a given. Givenness is one of the big terms in metaphysics. What's given? Taken for granted. You'll see Heidegger's method, the same thing. He has a big work on givenness. What does that mean? Present sync, givenness. This is the whole. So, in the analysis, where you say, well, givenness comes in from sensation. That's a given, and you begin from there, from impressions, ideas, and so on, you develop. But in the complexity of the human being, inside thinking, inside things other than sensation, than perception, all of a sudden there enter pieces in the analysis that are functioning as a given. Namely, he doesn't have to now put it in and explain it. No, he's not making fudge. He's not explaining it because it's unnecessary. I mean, a given means there's no explanation. In a Euclidean set, in an axiom set, that's what's taken as a given. And then you build a system. Then you have proofs and so on, you build a system. But it's a given. You don't go underneath the given. What are you going to find? Yes, you're going to switch fields and go into psychology. But in terms of metaphysics, thinking what the nature of these things are, you have inside the analysis a given. And to make the story short, part of the backdrop of this whole thing was reading a paper by somebody for his doctorate on Arab Jewish philosophy, metaphysics, and in my reading, I noticed, I practiced a Heidegger thing. Here's 600 pages for a doctorate. And I noticed his language. and in the language, I saw, here's an average person, a student working for a doctorate. I saw that he's making moves that are helping him with the analysis, but some of them are exactly like positive. In other words, they're performatives. And I raised it as a question. So he said, of course, the readers, they're not tuned into this kind of thing. But I certainly am. Because, as you know, coming from where was it first presented for me as a Torah person? In the halakha. You know, when I first came to one of the great Rabbeim and I said, you know, I studied the Torah and I got this and that, he said, you don't know anything about Torah. I heard through the great Rabbeim, a great philosopher, you don't know anything about Torah. I said, what do you mean? I read the Rambam, I don't know anything about Torah. What do you don't know anything about Torah? Well, the Torah system, at the center of which is the halakha, is a system that's based on performatives, on legal statuses, halachic statuses and their interrelation, their conditions and their consequences and how they relate, and how one in one context functions as an existence or a condition and so forth. But the basic orientation is the legal statuses. Well, of course, when I read the Rambam, I didn't read Moed Nevuchim. I didn't read the Mishnah Torah. I read Moed Nevuchim for the philosophers. So, of course, I was concerned with Tamei HaMitzvot, reasons for the mitzvot. Yeah, that's a philosophy concern. But what about Torah? Do I know anything about halacha? Then I came to Rav Soloveitchik in New York, and I studied in his class, and then I heard this whole orientation about the chalos and about the legal status. Then that was my beginning for sensitivity to the chalos. To end the story, when I came to Boston, they said, oh, this is Harvard, philosophy begins with Bertrand Russell. I said, what do you mean philosophy begins with Bertrand Russell? Which means Bertrand Russell and now Heidegger, performative utterance, John Austin, Wittgenstein, guys I never even heard of. But being up there and taking the courses, I realized I'm ignorant. I better study these guys also. So I studied these guys. And that was in the back of my mind all the time. And I studied the later Wittgenstein in philosophical investigations, and I began to see how much I was missing by being so immersed in the classical Greek orientation. Because for Torah, my man was the Rambam. My man was the Rambam. And that's a continuation of the classical Greek orientation. So who would argue with the Rambam? I'm going to argue with the Rambam? It took 35 years to begin to realize, well, maybe the Rambam is overstated. Maybe certain things are pulled out of context. Maybe if you examine his philosophy, oh yes, he was Aristotelian. But when you examine his halakha and you see how he works out and conceptualizes practical things, you will find maybe he's not insensitive to performative use of language in conversation and so on. So you begin to realize, wait a minute, there's a whole mythology that's come down with the Rambam. But you got to be big enough to say, hey, wait a minute, let's look at the Rambam in a different light. And indeed, if we have to throw it out, we're going to throw it out. We're going to reconstruct it. We're going to say, look, just like Heidegger said about Kant and everything, or about Nietzsche, he was on the track, but he didn't make it dominant. He didn't look at the world through the whole concept of performative language. And we, as Torah people, having been responsible to reconceptualize the Torah system in every tkufa, in our tkufa, the time has come to reconceptualize the system, the Torah system, with the help of the Shamash as the ninth candle. The Shamash is how we look at it. It gives the light to all the other candles. So from this point of view, it gives the light, but whereas in the past It gave the light of metaphysics and Greek philosophy and the Greek world, which is Chanukah was against. Today, it gives the light on metaphysics, but in a new mode, which is reminiscent and so fitting the whole understanding of Moshe Rabbeinu in the Torah system. I want to dedicate this talk to Linda's father, who had the outside this week, Chaim Tzvi Hirsch and Avram Yitzchak. He was a great chess player and a shtickle philosopher. A typical description of the great intellectuals of Europe. They came from Riga and Vince, Rogachev and Simcha, quite a bit. His father apparently was a chazan and davened there with Rameh Simcha in the same shul, so it's part of the real in-group of halacha and Torah. Anyway, the ninth candle of Chanukah. Now everybody knows that Chanukah has 8 days, so we celebrate with 8 lights and a Shamash. I'm not the first to write and talk about the ninth candle. Not meaning the Shamash, we'll see right away, but ninth candle. Now, Chaim Sabato, in one of his books, when I came into the Sephardi world by Chana marrying Roni, well, I had to learn how to eat Pesach matzah and a lot of other things, but so I don't know, what do I know about challah? Nothing. So, in one of his books, he talks about a nine place candelabra. And I said, well, what's that all about? It's 8 days. So what's 9 days? Apparently, there was a time there when there was a plague in the city, and to commemorate coming through that plague, they added another candle to Chanukah. Now, don't jump right away about halakha, because this is a hidur mitzvah. Lighting the 8 candles, either one way, according to Beit Shammai, or the other way, 8 to 1. This is a refinement and embellishment of the mitzvah, but the mitzvah in the Gemara is 1 candle each day. So, because I asked right away, well, wait, there's a halacha. I mean, I'm sure they wouldn't. This is the town of Ibn Ezra. they wouldn't break a halacha. They do something else. But here there's no halacha involved. It's a hidur mitzvah, an embellishment of the mitzvah itself. So therefore, to add a candle because of this commemoration is certainly within the halachic bound. Okay. Chanukah. For contemporary Israelis, Chanukah is the story of a great military victory. Some put Hashem in the picture, some don't. But the basic orientation is to say something about Chanukah that's relevant. And indeed, Israel, the new state, 1948, had to fight for its existence, is still fighting for its existence. And so Chanukah, in the literature, when you read, like you have a number of manuals and you read some of the literature, you see that the motif of the Israeli Chesed, Gvur, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, Malchut. That's 10. Well, everybody knows that Da'at is one of the Sefirot. Chabad is Chochmah, Bina, Da'at. I mean, so it's known that, so the question was, well, the system is built on 10, not on 9, or not on 11. So the basic point was, okay, what is this Da'at business? So, the basic orientation in the Kabbalah systematics was that there's Keter at the top, Chochmah, Bina, then Chesed, Gvur, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod, and Da'at is not in the picture. So, the basic orientation was that in the Kabbalah system, each of the Sefirot had many dimensions, And one of them was the outside dimension and the inside dimension. It's not important to know the details, but what the point was, there was an outside and an inside. And so, Dot was the inside of Keter. So therefore, the 10th Sphira was not itself, by itself, like the other 10, but it was a subset or a dimension, shall we say, of Keter. The inside teaching of Keter. And then there's the outside teaching. And Dot is the inside teaching. So what's the inside teaching? So Dot meant intelligence, problem solving, relating to practical things of life, and, as the word indicates for us in modern Hebrew, Mada comes from the word Dot, and after the scientific revolution, Dot included what we call science. Of course, science is much more than organized common sense and organized intelligence. However, it's the same orientation. There was Keter, the crown, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Chochmah, Bina, Da'at, Chesed, Gvur, Tiferet, Netzach, Hod, Yesod. So if Da'at is the inside of Keter, and Keter is at the top, so the question is obvious. Why, if it's Bimkom Keter, the Vilna Gaon's words are Da'at, Bimkom, 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 in the place of, instead of, his Lashon, instead of, Da'at, instead of Keter. Well, so it should be on the map, the usual diagram of the Sphirot, when it starts at the top and goes down and so forth. 1, 2, middle, 1, 2, middle, and so forth. So it doesn't work like that. It says Dot is the inside of Keter. Good. So it should go in the Keter slot. But it doesn't go in the Keter slot. It goes after Chochmah and Bina, which have to do with mental activities. It's not important for the moment. And between those mental activities, as a transition to the emotional world of chesed, kindness, and so forth. The next 6 are emotional, feeling dimension, and the malchut is the action dimension. So you have in the basic orientation, and I build on that, very important, that you have 3 fundamental packages of dimensions of the human being. The intellection, the feeling dimension, and the bodily dimension, the action dimension. And you heard many times from here that for me, each one of these exists in the field of the other 2. But there's a dominance. The dominance is there, like in a male and a female. There's a dominance. But each person, a male and a female, have male components and female components. But there's a dominance when you're a man, a dominance of one set and less of the other. And so the same thing happens. There is no intellection. There is no thinking without some sense of feeling, some sense of usability in action. And there's no feeling without action and without intellection. There's interrelation of functions and structures between these 3 domains. Of course, where are we in Western science? We're trying to understand something about the life system. Well, look at all the complexity. Look at all the complexity just from a little thing coming out of the Kabbalah of having these fundamental dimensions of the human being. Unbelievable. And we still work and striving for eventual breakthrough on how these things combine, how they dominate, and how they localize in different dimensions. Remember, you're dealing now from the body up till, including the unconscious. When Freud came out with the unconscious, it added another dimension to the human being. So it's not only consciousness, it's also the unconscious. Okay, so what do we see? We see that in Da'at, Bimkom, Keter, what we see is that instead of it being on the top, it's in the middle between the emotional dimension, the feeling dimension, and the intellectual dimension. Okay, this is the orientation in the Kabbalah. And as I said, when we look at it this way, we have Das Bimkom Keter, and Das means, in this orientation, includes the scientific understanding. Now, there are a number of principles in the Kabbalah that make this, drive it home. One is, Ein Tikkun Melamala Lamata. There is no perfectibility. There is no human being working on themselves for creativity, for development of different dimensions. There is none of that. Where am I? Without.
You're saying lamala lamata.
Yeah, none of lamala lamata. There is none of that from the top to the bottom. That's a fundamental principle in all of the Kabbalah system. Ein tikkun melamala lamata, which means that the tikkun, the perfectibility, starts from the actional dimension, moves into the feeling dimension, and up into the intellectual dimension. And indeed, on my understanding of the text, there's no keter. There's dot, bimkom, keter. So if you're starting at the bottom, 130 books, take a book by Russell on the topic, women, politics, Soviet Union, or whatever you want, 130 books, he was a great writer, and he knew how to make fudge. If you read carefully many times he writes, and all of a sudden he lost the argument. And instead was a nice chocolate pudding, but you didn't care. Well, a great writer, but nevertheless a great writer. And so I told the people, you got an A for a paper. Get the topic from Russell, write the paper. You'll find the places where he fumfers a little bit. That's your critical section. Open up, write your 3 pages on critical section, you got an A. That's it. Simple thing like that. Read Bertrand Russell. Okay. But Derech Agav, everybody knows, I got a letter from Bertrand Russell. He was known not to answer anybody. I wrote my dissertation on Whitehead. Whitehead worked with Russell on Principia Mathematica, and I had a Wittgenstein critique of Whitehead, and there was nothing in the literature. When you work for a doctorate, you don't want to do things yourself. You want to have sources. So you could say, okay, this guy said that, this guy said that. Well, there was nothing to say. I mean, there was nothing in the literature. I had to do it myself. Well, it makes you a little scared. But anyway, I wrote Russell a letter on those postal things that you fold up with Mr. Russell and this and that. No Kunsten or anything like that. And he was known not to answer. He said, look, read my books. And so I wrote him a letter asking him if he ever introduced Wittgenstein to Whitehead, because Russell wrote the introduction to Wittgenstein Tractatus in 1921. And so I had this thing, and sure enough, the talk of Boston. Joe Levinson got a letter from Bertrand Russell. I should put it online. Maybe it's worth $10,000. Because he didn't like the typist. She made a few mistakes, so he wrote in his own hand. He changed what she wrote. Okay, one day maybe we'll hit it. Go for it. But anyway, Bertrand Russell. Okay, so what I want to do now, just very briefly, is give over this fundamental piece, which was led to the conclusion that Torah is for science against philosophy, which is not for science. It has its own dimension and so on. Okay, so in the Kabbalah system, there's a famous discussion, clarification on what's called the 10 Sfirot. The Sfirot, in short, are a description of the world of the Neshama. Let's give you a full description of the world of the Neshama, and it was built on five units, but there was Keter, Chochmah, Bina, each one had a value of 1.0, and then there was Chesed, Bura, Tiferes, Netzach, so each one had a value of 0.1, and then Malchut had a value of 0.01. And so this was the whole system with Esesirot. But the problem was, when you say Das, well, that's the 11th Sphira. It's Keter, Chochmah, Bina, public vis-a-vis Chanukah is to make it relevant and to talk about the great victory. The issue of the oil that burned for 8 days, that's sort of played down or not mentioned much in that literature. But the basic point was this attempt to make it relevant, to say something that's relevant, that has some meaning for the people. Okay, Chanukah is against Greeks, Greek civilization, Greek society, and especially Greek philosophy. Now, one could argue that and say, look, you're narrowing it down too much when you limit it to Greek philosophy. However, it certainly was one of the key dimensions in the Hellenism and the whole development of medieval philosophy. We went through a legacy of Greek philosophy. It was a 1,000-year legacy until the 17th century. It was a big thing. And we had both sides of the fence. What's the value for Torah of philosophy, and does it help? Does it do something? Does it add? Or is it a detriment? And that battle still rages today, but this was the basic point. Chanukah is against Greek philosophy. But against means, what's it for? What's the pro? This is the negative. So, in the book on Chanukah that I wrote, we talked about and focused attention on this business of Greek philosophy versus Torah science. In this little book, I talked about showing, and I try to indicate, just set up the basic orientation to indicate that it was against philosophy, against metaphysics, which we'll get to right away, but in the name of or for Torah. And what was the point? On the back it said here, for example, Chanukah is a celebration of the victory of the Jewish faith over Greek philosophy, yet it envisions a future when both philosophy and faith will wane, and when Chaim, the life and vitality of every individual, emerges as the great principle to guide human interactions as well as our scientific ambitions. And the book was subtitled A Light for the Future, and that was the motif. What I want to do tonight is very briefly go over the basic argument, which is worth to listen to, in this book, and then switch into the modern inheritors of metaphysics, which in the West starts with Descartes, continues and has its great limelights, among their others, in Immanuel Kant, and then in the modern world in Nietzsche and Heidegger, and
Bertrand Russell.
no, Bertrand Russell's not in metaphysics, that's for sure. But he wrote. But I mean, Russell touched everything. I always told students of mine, if you want to get an A in a philosophy term paper, you take a book by Russell. You